Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I'm your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen-flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, Benny. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. I had a brilliant Sunday yesterday. No other way to call it. That was just so amazing. We went cross-country skiing, my wife and I. The kids and my wife just started doing that, and they really enjoyed. So yesterday we did our first... Yeah, we went out there for the first time together and it was really awesome. Yeah, and other than that, I did so many things. I played piano with my kids and we built some bird feeding things to put on the trees in front of our house. And as I said, went skiing and we chilled and we did a lot, but at the same time, it was very relaxed. So brilliant weekend, brilliant Sunday, and a good Monday as well so far. So how about you? Your week is just starting, right?
Yep, my week has just started. We've been talking for like an hour already, so it's like 7:30 now in the morning. But it was a great weekend for me as well. Did a 10K run that I was quite happy with. There was some excitement in the race that I won't even get into on here. I already told you about that. Just know, listeners, that it was intense. And what else is new? Oh, so last week I think I told everybody about my new wireless gear that I got, my new shiny Shure Axio wireless gear. So finally got it in my bag and been testing it out and very happy, but it's just funny to mention because I've been, rigged up with this audio bag, and you should head to my Instagram, Malcolm owen-flood is my Instagram handle, and check this out because I've got photos of me wearing my bag so you can kind of get an idea of what I look like wearing all this stuff. And I've been wandering around the farm that I live on, testing the range of stuff and walking down to the road and wandering around. And I feel like I look like the Unabomber or something, just cruising around. I'm getting some weird looks from my neighbors and cars going by.
That sounds
antennas
amazing.
Sticking all over the place and just listening.
Awesome. I thought this is going to be another new gear story, but you just tested the gear that you bought last week.
Just testing, right? Yeah. I was waiting on some components to really be able to use this stuff, and that's shown up. So it's all coming together now.
Awesome. Oh, that sounds really good, really great. I saw you did get a nice feature or a nice post about you from one of the companies that you use, right? Like the boom sort of thing.
A boom company called Ambient likes some of the photos I take with their boom poles. So they threw me up on their Instagram page, and then they also sent me a t-shirt, which is awesome. Pretty funny. It's the most dad joke nerdy t-shirt ever. It's got two boom poles crossing each other in an X, and it says Boom Squad. It's oh my God. This is geeky.
Yep, it is for sure. It's cool. It's cool though. Awesome. Great. Right. Yes. Yeah, sounds like a decent weekend though as well, right?
Pretty solid indeed.
Yeah. Congrats on the run, dude. I followed that, or at least your story and what I saw there, and you was a pretty fast time despite everything that happened in between. That you were telling me about.
All right. I feel like I should just quickly recap.
Yes.
Because everybody's just going to be confused. But essentially, there was volunteers controlling traffic, and this guy tried to slow down a van that was driving way too fast and, putting runners at risk. And he smacked us out of his van. Guy got out of the van, super angry, and punched this guy in the face, which was totally not cool. And you should never punch anybody in the face, and you certainly shouldn't when you're being an asshole speeding through a race. So me and my friend Sean had to jump in and get involved and make sure it didn't escalate beyond that. And it was a very intense thing, but Benny was saying, he's oh yeah, you would have totally done sub 50, because I did 53 minutes on my 10K. He's you would have been under 50 minutes if that didn't happen. But I'm not so sure, because me and Sean were our adrenaline was pumping so much that we were like rocket ships after that happened. Not what you expect at a community event. My Lord, it was crazy.
Yeah, pretty crazy story. Amazing though. I'm just glad you didn't actually get into a fight. It was all could all be solved, and nobody was hurt. Seriously, I hope so at least.
Yeah. The guy that got punched seemed all right. He bounced back pretty quick, but must have been a terrible day for him. Poor guy. Just it's unfortunate. Unfortunate, unnecessary violence. But yeah, so
if
you're listening
not what
out
you
there,
expect when you volunteer at a race.
Totally, yeah. If you want to be a good person, try not to punch volunteers in the face. It's a good motto to live by.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I feel better now. I think our audience deserves to hear that. So, okay, let's get to today's episode, though. And today's episode is about, it's actually a gear episode, but not really about not really about having to buy something, but about how to choose the right stuff. And to be more precise, how to choose the right guitar amps and or tones for your project that you're working on. That topic was top of mind because I was just recently talking to somebody who told me that he was always like insecure and unsure which amp or which type of amp to choose for any project that he was working on. And he didn't pay too much attention in the past to that. He used presets on amp sims, but he didn't really know which amp is appropriate for which genre or which song that he was working on. And I actually had that quite often when I talked to people, that they were confused about amp choices and the differences in tone and the differences in models and types of amps that there are actually. And so I feel like this is something we should talk about at some point in this episode. And I feel like it doesn't have to be so confusing. So we're trying to make it a little more simpler and easy to understand. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to know which type of amp to choose for any production. We're going to talk about why that is actually important, or let's say we talk about why people struggle to make that decision. It's due to various reasons. I think they just don't fully understand the differences between the available amps, and they think it's more complicated than it has to be. And then we'll break it down into some basic broad categories, explain the main tone and distortion characteristics of each of them, and give you great starting points, as well as ways to figure out whether or not a certain amp is appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish. So out of all of these options that you have, we're going to try to give you a couple of sort of buckets or categories of amps that you can just go to and pick and choose one of them, and the chances are that it's going to work. So obviously there's more nuance to that, but there's some like broad categories of amps that you can go to for a certain situation or genre that you're working in.
Yeah. We talked about this a little bit before getting started in the episode, just to kind of get organized. And essentially what this is going to break down to is just being real logical and organized and kind of compartmentalizing different sounds in your head into different categories and giving names to things, and then using that information to make decisions down the road.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this, because I basically prepared the outlines today, and it's just my way of thinking about it. And it's not a right or wrong thing, and other engineers or producers might look at it completely differently. It's just the way I sort of broke it down for myself to get an understanding of the whole thing and to make it easier for me to pick and choose amps. And I sort of developed some terminology or ways to think about or talk about it. So other people might disagree or go differently about it. And I'm curious to hear how you approach this, especially since I know you are a Kemper user. So you have a lot of options at your fingertips in your Kemper. And we all sort of have with amp sims, but the Kemper is a special case because you really have like all the amps in the world in one box, more or less. And I'm curious to hear your decision-making process, or how you come up with the right sort of Kemper profile or the right actual app, whatever you're using for any given situation, because I feel like it's a pretty intuitive thing for you to do, but it's not so simple for many people out there, and we try to explain our thought process behind that. I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, so I think we should rewind and address a common problem for all beginning engineers, and by saying engineers, I am lumping in people that are trying to become engineers, but also just in the case of our listeners, our audience, the bands that are trying to record themselves, are engineering their own records, right? And I don't think anybody starts that road without just recording the amp that they have as a default. And that makes total sense. You're not an idiot. It's number one, it's the amp you have. It is the amp that you have. So if you don't have another amp, of course, that's what you're using. But it certainly doesn't mean that it's the right amp. And early on in my career, I definitely did this. I would record the amp that we had available, and it was always the amp that the band brought with them. Like kind of always. It was like, okay, that's your amp, that's what we'll record. That's a pretty short-sighted move, because there isn't an amp that's right for every song. There's an amp that's right for every part even. And usually it doesn't happen to be the amp that they just carried in, because people buy new amps all the time trying to find the right sound. So making the assumption that you've already got it's just kind of short-sighted, I think. So I did find that if we started shooting out amps, we would dramatically improve the result. We'd find just like this works way better than the other amp that we tried at the start, kind of thing. Like, instead of using this Fender with a distortion pedal, we used a high gain Mesa Boogie or something. And it's like, and that sounds way more like we wanted. We wanted like a modern rock sound, and the rectifier is the one. And so if we hadn't done that, it would have been totally different. And so that got me thinking, okay, got to shoot out amps, got to have amps available. I started buying amps like crazy for a little bit. I didn't have that many, but I had options, and I would like to work in studios that had options, and I'd get the bands to bring whatever options they had as well. But the problem with that for me was that they're slow. It's like really time consuming to set up amps and shoot them out, especially if they're combos, or you don't have kind of like a tweaking setup where you can have the head in the room with you. I mean, there's all sorts of, it just like, it comes down to it. That takes a lot of time to shoot out amps. So that was why I went with a Kemper, because I can like shoot out 12 amps in 12 seconds. It's just,
and you can even, if you're watching on YouTube right now, this is Elmo. He just woke up. It's my
jumped on your shoulder. That was adorable.
Just jumped on my shoulder. Now I'm a little nervous because he's crawling around the computer.
Yeah, they have a way of clicking the stop record button accurately.
Exactly. So, I'm totally with you there. And even, I think the Kemper works well, even if you don't actually use the Kemper tone. I mean, you totally can, and you do a lot, and it's great. But just to figure out which amp is the right one, it's so quick to do that on a Kemper, even if you then go and actually get the real one. But you can speed up the decision-making process so much by just going through the different models on a Kemper. And then you can always go out and rent the real one or whatever. And I wanted to say that the whole renting thing, people often think that their amp that they want to have, like the ideal amp, is out of reach, or they just have to use whatever they have. And many people don't realize how accessible that actually can be. Like, there are spec-line rentals. You can have an amp for a week or so, and it won't cost you a fortune. Like, you can rent those things. So you can't obviously rent them all and shoot them out, but if you have a way of testing with Sims or a Kemper or whatever, or just knowing what we do in this, learning what we teach you in this episode, like knowing the basic broad categories, then you can just pick and choose one or two or three and shoot them out and use them on your production. So it's really accessible. It's doable. You don't have to use what you have, although that is what we all do in the beginning. But it might be worth looking beyond that. Before we go further into this, I want to say that I know that there are other factors than the amp that go into a guitar tone. So before people say like, yeah, but there's the cab and the mics and all of that. In this episode, we intentionally only talk about the different types of amps and focus on that. And yeah, we agree that a cab is very important, but that would just be too much for one episode. And you still have, even if you have a great cab and you've made the decision there, you still have to have the right category or type of amp for the genre. So that being said, it's all about the amps. So yeah, with the Kemper, it's just super quick to compare these models. And I assume you have some, or maybe you don't, but when I had a Kemper, I had sort of a way of sorting my my profile. So I had folders, or a structured way of finding my go-tos. And everybody does that differently, I think. The first thing I think about when I think of different amp models is the amount of distortion. So I think about high gain amps versus clean amps versus like crunch, sort of in the middle amps, or settings on a Kemper, because some amps can do all of that, and then you have different channels or settings. But like, these are the broad categories that I go to first. And there are some amps that do the high gain thing really well, and there are other amps that do the clean thing super well. And then there are typical rock or blues amps or something like that can give you a great crunch tone, but they never go to full high gain distortion really well. Yeah. Is that similar to how you think about it?
That is exactly how I think of it. I think of it in brands, like, because I've just associated sounds with certain brands. So like, the Vox sound is a different type of sound than the Fender sound. And vice versa. Fender is different than Vox, and the Marshall is its own thing as well. And then PV, they've got their 5150 kind of sound on lock. I mean, there's now some great alternative 5150s that do similar things, but like that's kind of a category. Even if I was trying to find an EVH, which is like a 5150 remake kind of thing, I would just, in my head, I'm thinking PV.
Yeah.
So I've got it categorized by kind of brand, even though all of these brands have a spectrum of sounds, like Marshall tries to make clean amps and Fender tries to make dirty amps, but like, what do they do best? What are they famous for? And I can identify those sounds and where I've heard them and when I've used them and when they've worked and think, okay, that's probably a good starting off point if we go with this Marshall, because this is like, we want classic rock guitar tones. Marshalls are the king of that.
Yeah, agreed. So let's give examples for these categories. I'd say some of them, actually the ones that you mentioned are perfect examples for these categories, actually. So on the clean side, I would immediately think Fender Tube Amp or the Roland Clean Jazz Chorus amps.
Totally.
When I think crunch or like distorted but not really high gain and sort of a mid-forward sort of sound, I think AC30 Vox.
Yep, Vox.
Not the biggest low end, not the shiniest top end, but like an aggressive mid-range sort of crunch sort
Sharp
of tone.
Transient.
Yep, pretty punchy. And when I think high gain, I think what you said, like 5150 PV or Mesa, or the German amps like Diesel or Engel, things like that. Soldano, obviously, like sort of these high gain amps. And those amps, like the bigger sort of high gain amps, they have clean channels and they have crunch channels often. Like there are sometimes 2, 3, 4 channel amps. And some of them, and we get to that later why that is, but I just want to mention some of them have pretty great clean tones. So it's a weird thing that for the crunch stuff, I have a couple of amps that I would go to. And for the high gain things like amps, some of those I would also use for shiny cleans, but not so much for everything in between. It's really like, I feel these amps can do the extremes really well. So we're going to talk about why that is and why I think that is. And usually the crunch sort of amps are like one-trick ponies, more or less. I think about like a Plexi or an AC30 or, like these amps. Yeah, exactly. So you can get some decent overdrive and distortion out of them, and some of them take pedals really well. So some of the Marshalls especially, that's a different thing. But I think they are less versatile, whereas the big high gain amps can do high gain well, and often also really shiny, clean cleans.
Totally.
So
yeah, like a dual rectifier clean channel is pretty cool in my opinion.
Yeah,
but it's it's not what you think of when you think of a Mesa dual rectifier. You think of big, early 2000s rock guitar.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, that brings us to the next. Like the next one is going to be really quick, and then the third thing on my list that is where I go into explaining why the clean and the high gain go so well together for me, at least. So the next point here is tube versus solid state. There's not so much to say about this. I think it's just important to know that there's these two concepts. There's tube amps and there's solid state amps. At some point, manufacturers thought we don't need tube circuits anymore, and solid state was the new thing, and it didn't need as much maintenance. It was cheaper. So they built these sort of amps, but tubes never really went anywhere, and everybody got back to tube amps eventually. There are some exceptions. There are the Randall amps, for example. These are high gain amps that are solid state. Pantera used them, for example. So they have a tone, they have a sound. So there are solid state amps that are actually great. There are hybrid designs like the Wolf State Marshall series that actually is pretty decent. So they have a transistor power amp, but a tube preamp. Right. Those designs can work well, but they are the exception. So most people that actually use physical hardware amps use tube amps, I think. So these are the common go-to options.
Now, I do want to mention that if you are using digital solutions like Kemper, Pod, Quad Cortex, or amp sims in your computer, I still think of these the exact same way. When I'm looking for an amp inside one of the things, I think tube or solid state, because these digital solutions now sound so good and real that it's kind of the same. You just, like, if you choose a solid state modeled amp, it's going to sound like that. And if you choose a tube modeled one, it's going to sound like a tube amp. So it's the exact same. You just think of it as if you have real amps in front of you.
Yeah, exactly. The one thing I think that solid state really does well, and that's the reason why it's used for bass amps so often, for modern bass amps, is it gives you a lot of headroom, and it gives you really clean cleans with a lot of headroom if you want that. So in order to make a bass amp really loud, in order to be able to turn that up really loud without distorting it, you need a very powerful, very clean amp with lots of headroom, because the low end has so much energy, and you need a big amp, again, with clean headroom. And solid state amps can do that very well. Tube amps tend to distort earlier. So an amp pack bass amp is an amp pack tube bass amp is going to be really loud, but it's also going to be dirty or dirtier than a solid state sort of bass amp. So that's the one thing, at least in the way I think about it, is that solid state amps have a lot of headroom, can be clean, and they can have a very precise distortion characteristic as well. So it's not
right.
worse or better or anything. It's just different. So yeah, but I think we can agree that most people like, or we have gotten so used to the way the tube amps sound and the way they saturate and distort, that most people like tube amps and the way they sound. And if we want to use solid state, it should be an intentional thing probably. And there's only a couple of amps that we would call go-tos maybe. So okay, but the next thing here is the really important thing for me. And a lot of people might view that completely differently, but I think in those two categories as well, like after I've decided if I want high gain or medium crunch sort of gain or clean, I think British versus quote unquote American. So in my head, the British designs are the mid-forward, dirtier designs like Marshall, Orange, the Vox, but Vox is its almost its own category of amps. I think the AC30 just has a sound where, like at least to me. But I think the British classic, a little more mid-forward, a little dirtier sort of amp design versus the more hi-fi sounding, massive, huge, and modern sounding, high gain American sort of modern design. That's the way I think about it. So this would be Mesa, Soldano, those sort of amps, and maybe. So I said before that the high gain amps, and I mean the more modern American designs, as I call them, I think they work well as clean amps sometimes, and that's because they have a lot of headroom. They're usually pretty powerful amps. They are often like 100 watts, 120 watts, something like that. And they are designed to be pretty precise, and they have a massive low end. They have pristine like top end. It's a more hi-fi sounding thing versus the more British amps. They often can't even do real cleans, because even the cleans will be slightly distorted. So I had an Orange at some point, and if you ever played a Plexi or an 800 or something like that, you can get clean tones out of them, but they are never really clean, So it's always a little dirty, a little more mid-forward, and not so shiny and big as the other sort of style of amps. So that's the way I think about it. And I think part of it has to do with the power, and part of it has to do with the tube choice and just the overall circuit design that's designed to be massive with a big low end and a shiny top end versus the mid-forward, crunchy, dirty sort of thing. At least that's how I think about it, how I perceive it.
No, I'm right with you. I like this all translates to how I perceive it as well. I think we're on track.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. So I think it's helpful to think about it in those broad categories, because it doesn't matter as much as most people think if you use, let's say, a Marshall or an Orange. Of course, they're different amps. They're going to sound different. But if you choose an amp that uses the same tubes and a similar circuit design, and if you swap out the amp on the same cab, it could make less of a difference versus like using those amps and swapping out the cab. So the cab could have a bigger influence on your tone than the amp if you use two amps out of the same category. So it's going to be different if you use a Plexi versus, or like an 800 Marshall versus a rectifier maybe. That's going to be a bigger difference. But if you choose two amps of the same category, the difference won't be as drastic. Or if you've ever compared a rectifier versus a Soldano versus a Dietzel versus an Engel versus, all these high gain amps, they can all do the job pretty well. It's a matter of taste, and it's like subtle differences. But I think all of them would work well on a modern metal record, and the cab will make a bigger difference than switching between those amps.
Totally. Yeah. We said we wouldn't get into cabs and stuff, but just to remind everyone, the guitar and the cabs make a bigger difference than the amp, in our opinion. At least I think your opinion as well, Benny.
Okay, cool.
Right? Like, do you agree with that?
Yeah,
like, it's
totally.
Like the amp is kind of, the type of amp makes a huge difference. Like, that's what we're saying. There's like this ballpark thing you have to get right. But after that, it's kind of less of a thing.
Yeah. And do you agree with the categories that I explained? So is there an additional category that you have in mind? And for me, it's really very simple. It's like these two categories and the different amounts of gain, sort of.
No,
That's
totally.
basically all there is to it. But maybe you have a different sort of category that I haven't thought about. As I said, I think the Vox thing is almost a thing on its own. But
Kinda,
maybe you have...
I think our list is really ordered well here. It's like high gain, crunch, or clean. And say crunch is the goal. I'm like, okay, that narrows it down to me and it's like edge of breakup crunch, maybe let's stick with. So like not classic rock crunch, but like the softer side, but definitely it's not clean. And so like, I'm like, okay, Vox is definitely a contender in there. And when I say Vox, all of a sudden I'm like, anything that mimics an AC30. So like Morgan AC20s are some of my favorite amps on the planet. They're so good sounding. And they do that job really well. But then I would also be like, okay, what about some of like the smaller wattage Fenders that do break up as you push them, like a Champ or something, you know?
Oh yeah.
They get nasty and do that job as well, but totally different. But it's still like edge of breakup crunch option for me. And then a quieter plexi, like you said. It doesn't really do clean. It's still dirty, but it's cleaner. So it's like that's another flavor of that same job for me. So it's like crunch decides what brands and models I picture working, and then I can quickly look at those different options and see which one is actually going to work.
Totally. Versatility is maybe a thing we could mention. So if you can only have one amp and you need different styles, different tones, then maybe a classic 800 one like channel version is not the right choice. Maybe you need an amp with more flexibility. Maybe you need something. There's actually a pretty cool modern Marshall amp that I don't see a lot of people talk about, but I really love it. Most modern Marshall designs are not so popular, and most people go for the classic Jvm 800 or the Plexis. But there is the Jvm Amp. There's a 50-watt version and a 100-watt version, and it has... Marshall says it has all the original legendary Marshall circuits, the analog circuits in one amp. So it's almost a modeling amp, but completely analog. It's heavy as like, it's crazy heavy. It has all these, it's like, I think it has 4 channels, and each of those channels has 3 different voicings or so. So it's a lot of circuits in one amp, but they all sound really great. And you can, at least in theory, that's what Marshall wanted to do with this. You can have an 800, you can have a Plexi, you can have a modded 800, you can have all these options at 2000 in one amp. And it actually is a really great sounding amp. And that is super flexible, super versatile. So that might be worth thinking about. Then also, as we said, the high gain modern amps oftentimes also have different channels. So versatility is a thing. But yeah, so I think we are on the same page here. Then to me, the next thing that I like to think about is if I need a lot of volume or not, and how the amp will behave if I turn it up. So what I'm saying here is there's high and low power or wattage amps, sort of. There's these 100 watts or 120 watts amps, but you can also buy a 15 watt amp or even below that. And then I had an Orange at some point that had the cool option of you could turn off some of the power amp tubes, and then you could sort of bring it down from 30 to 15 and even to 7.5. which would give you different characteristics, and you could drive it harder. So all that to say, I don't really care about that too much. That's why it's not top priority on my list here. It's just the next thing I think about. Do I really need a lot of volume? And if so, why exactly? Most of the time, I don't need that in the studio, but it's worth thinking about if you, let's say you do, I don't know, a live recording, and the amp has to be, for whatever reason, the amp has to be loud in the room, and like, you know, like these sort of things. So maybe if the amp is too small, but you still want clean or crunch tones and not distort too much, maybe you need a little bit more power in order to pull that off, because it will distort otherwise. Those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about.
I would say that's a good way to think about wattage, is like the higher wattage, the longer it might stay clean. Yeah. That said, there's totally high wattage amps that are like really just built to be dirty, but in general, that's kind of a good rule of thumb. I personally love sitting around the 50 watt range. I find that's like a good spot that gives me like, I can get really dirty, and it's more than loud enough usually. Where with 100 watts, sometimes you have to push it so hard to get loud and to get distorted, but it's like why does it have to be so loud?
Yeah, exactly. Which I think we should go to the next point here to explain that further, because the concept of an amp usually is that there is a preamp where this is the input where you plug your guitar in, and there's the gain knob, and there's probably an EQ or something like that, the tone section. And then all of that goes into the power amp. And the power amp is just what you need in order to turn that up and bring it up to a speaker sort of signal that can drive a speaker. Because the preamp will give you a line output signal that is pretty weak, that can't drive a speaker. So you need a power amp in order to bring that up, and so you have a signal that is capable of driving a speaker. And that means that most of the tone comes from the preamp, and the power amp was just there in order to make it loud.
Yeah.
And yeah, power amps have a sound, especially tube amps, of course, but that was just a byproduct, a side effect of it. Actually, it was just meant to be able to turn up the tone that you created in the preamp. And back in the day, those power amps had to be pretty powerful because PA systems weren't that great, and you had to have a really loud amp on stage in order for that to work. So these days, it's not as important anymore to have that sort of volume.
Totally.
Also, some of the early and legendary amp designs have been designed to be bass amps as well. So you need the power in order to have enough headroom, again, to be able to reproduce loud, clean tones for a guitar, but especially for a bass. So like a Fender Bassman or something, this is a bass amp and a guitar amp. Same for the Ampeg V4 and other designs. So there you need those powerful power amps in order to be able to play clean tones loud. Exactly. That all being said, it's just the sound of the power amp is not as important. It's just a side effect of turning it up with a tube circuit. You could also have, if you have something like a Kemper with a power amp built into it, it's a solid state amp that's really powerful. And that is just clean volume. It sounds the same whether you turn it up or not. And only tube circuits give you that extra bit of, like, it's not even better. It's just a different sound if you really crank them. But it's not nearly as important as people think it is. So a lot of people think that a bigger amp for some reason sounds more powerful, or that a smaller amp is better because you can crank it more and then it sounds better. The reality is it's mostly about the volume and the headroom, and the power amp sound itself is not nearly as important as people think it is. Most of the tone comes from the preamp. It's really like that. There's no magic with the power amp. Yeah. And even I've seen people, and it's the last thing I want to say, I've even seen people a lot of times actually really overdoing it with the power amp. So there is a sweet spot where it sounds great, and then there's this, it sort of breaks up a little bit. It can be pleasing sounding, but if you go too far, it will actually sound worse oftentimes, and you lose dynamics, and it can break up too much. And so it's not about cranking it all the way. You have to find the sweet spot, and it's not so easy to do, especially because the amp will be so loud that you'll have a hard time judging that standing in front of it. So a lot of times when people think they found the sweet spot or their amp sounds better, it's just that it's crazy loud in the room, and they just like the feeling of a loud amp in front of them. But if you compare it at same volume, it wouldn't be as big of a difference.
Yeah, totally. And there's a lot of things to consider there. Even though you're close mic in a cab, cranking it in the room is going to create extra stuff bouncing around. It will affect what is captured in that microphone. Sometimes that's nice, sometimes it's not. I find that more so than the preamp actually making a difference, it's that you're hitting the speaker harder and the speaker is starting to react different, and there's a sweet spot for that for sure. But like, again, with 50 watts, I can obliterate that speaker and go way too far. Yeah. Like with like an external cab. So it's like, you don't need a lot to hit a speaker hard. A 20 watt amp's going to be plenty loud if you want to drive a speaker. No problem.
Oh yeah, you're totally right. Sometimes people think they hear the power amp, but they actually hear the speaker saturating because there's limited movement. Like the speaker is moving, but there's a limit to that. And if the speaker reaches that limit, it will move differently. It will saturate. There will be, if you think of a speaker as if you picture a sine wave movement where the speaker goes in and out in a smooth way, as soon as you hit that limit, there are going to be wrinkles on that sine wave because the speaker is compressing and moving faster, and it's going to add additional harmonics. So people will hear the speaker saturation and compression and think it's the power amp, but oftentimes the speaker reaches its limit before the actual power amp. So yeah, you're right. That with a 50 watt or even lower, you have more flexibility maybe because you can reach the power amp saturation, but you can also drive the speaker hard, and it's a good compromise. But I wouldn't worry about it too much, honestly. It's much more important to pick the right amp design, the right amount of gain, distortion that you want, and the right sort of tone. Like as I said, like massive low end, or do you need a more mid-forward thing? These sort of things are way more important than worrying about the power amp. That's just what I wanted to say, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, no, totally with you.
Cool. Now, the next thing is interesting because we talk about amps all the time, but we all know that a lot of the amp tones or guitar tones that we love are not just the amp, but the pedal and the amp in combination. Like you can plug directly into the amp and that will give you those characteristics that we've been talking about. But there are some amps, at least that's again the way I think about it, that take pedals very well. And there are others that don't do that as well, to me at least. And then you can sometimes turn a medium gain amp into a high gain monster with the right sort of pedal. And with other amps that doesn't work really well, you can take a really cool clean amp, put a distortion pedal in front of it, and it can sound massive. You can choose the clean channel on a high gain amp. Like there's all these different combinations and options. And I wonder how you think about that, because again, I like to not overcomplicate this. I like to keep it simple. I rely on the amp characteristic first, and I only add pedals if I can't get what I want out of the amp. And I typically don't do the clean channel but distortion pedal thing. I typically choose the appropriate distortion channel and the right amp. And if I feel like it's not enough or it needs some extra character, I might boost it or put something in front of it if the amp takes it well. But I usually don't use a clean amp and then get the distortion from the pedal. But I know people who do that and it works well for them. It's just totally. I just wonder how you go about that.
Yeah, I do have thoughts on this. I'm the same way. I find that amps generally do the job best for just determining the primary tone. So like that's where 90% of it is coming from, is the amp choice and the gain structure of that amp. And when you think about pedals, I like especially gain pedals, be that a distortion or an overdrive or whatever. I think of it as them trying to make an amp in a box, really. They're like, okay, we need to make a Jvm 800 in this or whatever it be. And yeah, some of them do a really good job, but like think about the footprint. There's a lot more room to make that work inside of an amp generally. Not to say that pedals can't do it, for sure. Now, the only time that seems to change for me is with like fuzz tones. Yeah. So with fuzz 100%. Tones, it seems like it's all about putting it into like the most clean and full sounding amp possible. Because if you're putting it into like a high gain or like even like plexi kind of distorted amp, it's like the tone has already been squeezed and turned into like this little narrow thing, and the fuzz doesn't have as much to play with or something. Right? So for whatever reason, I'm finding that I like clean amps for fuzz pedals, but otherwise it's usually the amp distortion for me. Yeah.
There are these special cases where the pedal is the tone, where, like, agreed, the fuzz. Although I sometimes like the classic Big Muff or something can work in front of a distorted amp, and people do that live all the time where they switch that in and out. So it can work, but in the studio, if I have the option, I would try it on a more massive sounding, cleaner, more headroom type of amp and then crank the pedal more. So I agree there. There are also special cases, like if you want the typical Swedish death metal tone, there's the Jvm 2 and stuff like that only the pedal sounds like that. It's not really good sounding, but the ugliness is what you want there. You want the chainsaw sort of sound, and that comes from that solid state pedal that just has that sound. So yeah, there is applications for and special cases for those type of things. And then some amps just take them really well and others don't. So I always think about, again, a Jvm 800, for example, is an amp that takes pedals very well for me. So I can turn it up to the amount of distortion that I want, and then I can throw a tube screamer in front of it or a more aggressive distortion pedal. It will just work really well. There are other amps that don't do that as well, or like, and then, I think, I don't know, that's subjective probably, but I always think about an 800 as an amp that takes pedals well for me. That's just almost my go-to for things like that. Plexis can be cool sometimes, but they break up a little in a more dirty, ugly way. Sometimes the 800 tends to sound smooth, even if you put a really aggressive distortion pedal into it. So I'd agree. And it's funny that because like the only use of pedals we're really talking about enjoying is stuff that just causes the amp to get hit harder. Like a tube screamer or a boost pedal. All we're doing is just taking our guitar chain and throwing it into that amp a little harder with maybe a slightly different EQ curve,
and we're still relying on the amp to distort, but because we're feeding it more, it's distorting more.
Yeah.
So we're just getting more of that amp, really, is what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I'm a huge fan of short cable runs for recording guitars. I find the less cable you have in front of the amp, the better. And I know there's people that with like a Fender Strat in the treble position and a Fender amp, like clean amp, that are like, oh no, like I want to lose some of that high end with a long cable. And that's fair. But in most cases, I would say try and have a short cable and accept that super bright new string thing and give your mixing engineer that room to play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it does make a difference. The longer cable makes things darker. In fact, there's even this, I don't know if you know that about the classic AC/DC tone, where they used, back in the day, they used the first sort of wireless systems that were available. Mm-hmm. And those didn't, it's like no cable is between the guitar and the amp. And they didn't compensate for that. So it gave them a really bright, aggressive, transient, heavy tone. That what they used on stage and what they liked. In the studio, when they tried to plug into the amps, the sound was different. So they used those crappy wireless things in the studio as well to get that same tone.
That's funny.
And on later models and on modern like wireless devices, there's oftentimes a switch where you can adjust the high frequency attenuation to sort of mimic what a cable does.
Totally.
So longer cable runs make a difference for sure.
Yeah, and keep in mind that's not just cables. Like anything you stick in the way, like when you stick a pedal in the way, it's got to go through all this extra circuitry to get out of there, and there's going to be some kind of loss and alteration to what's coming out of your guitar at all those steps. So just only whatever is essential to the chain should be there. Otherwise, be as close to that amp as you can.
Yeah. And I think that's too much for this episode, but I want to tell people that it's crucial if you use a pedal board to do your homework, do some research there, because it's more complex than you might realize. It's not only that you should keep only the essentials in there, but also the order of things matters. It matters if you use a buffered or unbuffered pedal and stuff like that, and if the tuner is first or last in the chain, depending on the model and all those things. So just it's worth doing your research there and setting up your pedal board properly, and maybe experimenting also with the order of things, because it makes a difference. And I know for a fact that a lot of people just put that stuff on a pedal board connected and that's all they think about. But there's more to it. So yeah, I think that's worth knowing. Then I know that people are going to be like, yeah, but pedals are so much more than it's so versatile, and a lot of tone comes from the pedals. And yeah, if you've ever seen people like Kurt Ballou create their guitar tones, they use all sorts of pedals, and it's much more than just the amp. So I know, as we said, for special occasions, special effects, or certain types of gnarly distortion, you can't do that with an amp, and you need those pedals, and there are tons of them, and we all love them, and it's cool. But still, everybody, I think, goes for a certain amp design first, and then with the pedal in mind, maybe that they want to use. But this episode is more is about the amp more than the pedals, because there's just so much to talk about when it comes to pedals, and we realize that they make a difference, and that there are hundreds, thousands, I don't know, of different models. But still, understanding the basic amp concepts is crucial for all of that, I think. So let's talk about some tricks for getting the most out of your amp, like some actionables. We've discussed the different designs. We've discussed which ones we like to use for certain things. Maybe we should recap real quick. So just a couple of examples. Modern metal or metalcore, things like that. It's going to be PV, Mesa, Soldano, this category. Classic rock or punk rock tones, or like everything rock, more or less. And also like more gnarly tones with pedals in front of them would be the Marshall Orange category to me.
Yep.
And then clean stuff, depending on how clean you want it, could be Fender Twin, Roland Jazz Chorus, maybe a clean channel of a big high gain amp if you want shiny, modern sort of cleans. And then there's the AC30 that is really punchy, has a little bit of a smaller low end to me, but it's like really aggressive, bright sounding if you want it to be. Mm-hmm. So, and also indie rock distortion is great on AC30, I feel like.
Yeah, it is a very cool, chimey grip, but still clean somehow.
Yeah. So yeah, what like blues? What would you use for a blues or more moderate blues, rock sounding thing?
I mean, yeah, like for blues, I'm like a Fender guy, cranked up a little bit. But if it's like rock as the primary, and maybe rock, like blues rock, but like blues rock means rock to me. That's when I switch into Marshall mode.
Plexi, something like that.
Yeah. I'm a huge 800 guy. I love 800s.
Me too. And there's also different models of that, by the way. And 800 is not an 800. There's like the different, 2204, 2203. There's the biggest difference is probably between the master volume version and the one channel, and the one without a master volume. And then there's multi-channel versions of that, and there's different designs basically. So there's a version of the 800 where the gain knob is also the volume knob, and then there's a version where you have a master volume that you can turn down. Yep. And then there's a 2-channel option, I think. Mm-hmm. So please don't quote me on that. I'm not entirely sure about all the different models, but there's different 800s for sure. But I like them in general.
They do all have a sound. And actually, we said that like choosing the right amp gets you in the right ballpark, and it's not that important after that point. But if you want to be, the more homework you do, the better. So if you look it up and you're checking out a band that has a tone that's similar to what you're hoping to get, and you're like, oh, they used an 800, try and find out what one, because like Rage Against the Machine is a 2205, and that sounds very different than, I can't think of another 800 record that would have been like a 2204 right now, but probably all the other ones. It is quite different. And both are going to get that job done. They're both Marshall distorted amps, but if the more you know, the closer you're going to get to what's in your head.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. Yeah, then I think that sums it up really, really well. It's just important to not use let's say, to give an opposite, like a bad example, if your first practice amp, for example, was, I don't know, some small combo amp or maybe a Fender or something like that, but then you decide to join a metal band, and now you're cranking that Fender to get the distortion, this will never really sound like your favorite metal bands. So maybe you need a different amp now. And and I see so many people do exactly that. They start with a Strat and maybe a Fender amp, and then they join this metal band and they just keep what they have, when they should actually use, I don't know, an ESP and a PV or something, and vice versa. So, the other way around is probably more doable. So because those bigger amps are usually more flexible, but still, maybe a great Fender amp or an AC30 will still be better for your crunch or clean tones than the high gain monster you have right now. So that's basically what we're trying to say. And now for the tricks for getting the most out of an amp. There's things that are very common that we do in the studio to manipulate what an amp is doing on its own to make it even more suitable for the genre, or to compensate for their weaknesses maybe. One popular example would be, and so many heavy bands do that, myself, and I do that all the time, myself included, is, for example, using a tube screamer in front of a high gain amp.
Right.
And we don't do that for the distortion, because the high gain amp will give us much more distortion than the tube screamer. The tube screamer actually sounds more like a blues sort of distortion, and it's kind of not a really beautiful distortion to me. But what it does is, if you turn the gain all the way to the left, like the distortion, I don't know what it's actually called in the tube screamer. Is it called gain? I think so.
I think it says gain, but whatever the dirty one is.
The one on the left. If you turn that all the way to the left, or just a tiny amount of it maybe, then you won't hear much additional distortion from the pedal. But the right dial, the one on the right side, that says, I think, what does it say on the tube screamer?
I think it's gain, tone, output, isn't it?
It could be output, could be level, could be something like that. The one on the right side. It's so intuitive for me. I don't even know what it says, although I'm using it all the time. So if you turn that up, that's the output of the pedal. And what that does is it just puts more level into your amp. So it's actually pretty much the same as like cranking the gain knob on your amp. So you can boost an amp that doesn't have enough gain with the tube screamer, but that's not what I do with the high gain combination. That's just one thing you can do with it. Use it as a booster for weaker amps. What I wanted to say is, I turn the distortion of the tube screamer all the way down. I find a spot on the tube, on the tone knob, usually a little bit on the brighter side, that I think sounds cool. And then I just turn on the pedal. And what that does is, it has a box tone. It means the pedal has a unique sound to it. It compresses the low end a little bit. It makes the low end a little bit smaller and more controlled. And it has a mid-forward sound. And what that does is, you get a tighter low end, you get a less boomy, woofy sort of low end that these massive amps often have, especially when you go into jugs and like palm mute stuff. They can really become a little uncontrolled, and so the tube screamer sort of compresses that a little bit and controls it more. So I just think it sits better in the mix. And then also it has this mid-forward characteristic that gives you extra attack and extra scratch, like an extra pick scratch or pick attack almost. I find it just cuts through the mix better oftentimes. So I like that about it. And then there is this weird overall compression where I feel like I can use less distortion on the actual amp, but I still have all the sustain in my palm mutes, for example. I really like that about a Tube Screamer. So the moment I turn it on, I feel like I can turn on the gain quite a bit, but when I do palm mutes, the tone doesn't die in between. It still has this, after every single chug. And if you turn off the Tube Screamer, it just dies too quickly. So it gives me additional sustain without much more distortion, which results in a clearer tone and more chord and note definition.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can describe it, I think. And that's what most people use it for. So it's not really about the distortion at all. It's just about the way the pedal sounds. You just turn it on, and that's what you want, basically.
Yeah. It's just like a little tightening, and then like the little transient poke it gives is really nice too. It's just is like a little, man, the tone's a little more finished now.
Yeah.
And yeah, my most common pedal, boost pedal, hands down. So I'm just like, oh, this amp sounds great. I just wish we could hit it a little bit harder. And guitar volume's always max. So boost pedal in front, just a little bit louder, amp breaks up a little bit more without turning up the gain more, which sounds different.
Depends on the pedal though, but for some pedals, I think it's pretty much exactly the same. It's just turning up the input, like the gain, but sometimes it sounds different totally. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Like pedals have sounds again, right? So it's like, if you got a boost you like, that just kind of throws more of a certain frequency into it, that's going to change the response. That's the thing. Yeah. The frequency response of the pedal, I think. It's the beauty of reamping. Again, we talked about that in a different episode where you can go in and EQ your DI before you hit the amp, which is a beautiful thing because the amp will react completely different to the input signal depending on the frequency content. And a lot of boost pedals do exactly that. They might have a tight or low end, or they might have a mid-range push or whatever, Yeah. I find I tend to like ones that have a little bit of a shine to them. So they like the top end breaks up a little sooner into the amp because it's hitting it just louder. I like that.
Yeah. You got to know that tubes and analog distortion in general is like a non-linear process. That means that it reacts to the input signal. So two different input signals will give you a different result. It's not a mathematically clean process that's the same every time, no matter what you send into it. It's like it's totally program and input signal dependent. So the tone of the pedal you use in front of the amp is going to affect which frequencies are going to distort first. You just said it, Malcolm. If the top end distorts a little sooner, you get a different characteristic. But if you send, for example, a fuzz pedal into it that has a lot of low end or something, or that makes the low end distort earlier, you get a different tone. Like all these things, just the amp just reacts completely differently depending on what you do. So I like the boost pedal thing that you just mentioned, and it's cool for people to know that not all of them are the same. So you might be looking at different boost pedal options, and they probably will sound different.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like some distortion pedals, when you turn down the gain, they pretty much shut off. But like the Tube Screamer, like you said, you can just have the gain fully to the left, not doing anything, and it still it's essentially like a boost pedal. And there's other distortion pedals you can totally do that with as well. I think the Super Overdrive works pretty good, if that's the one I used to have. Can't really remember now, but like gain super low on that, but it's got like an EQ curve to it that is different.
Yeah. The famous clone pedal, for example, that everybody's raving about, where they charge ridiculous prices for the original ones on the used market, which is kind of crazy. But there are certain pedals that have a signature sound, and in most cases, by the way, you can buy the reissue or the modern version of it, and it's just gonna be fine. You don't have to spend 10x the amount for the original vintage one. It's just bullshit in most cases. I use the Maxon Tube Screamer, which is in fact the original Ibanez design from the 80s. They designed it back then for the original 808, and still people are willing to pay 5 times that for the original one. Yeah. Even though it's the exact same circuit to this day in the Maxon Overdrive that I use, and it's like $120 or something. So yeah,
it's so crazy.
Yeah. Anyway, so okay, cool. Then there's something I want to mention, and that is, I don't know if you do that a lot, that is using attenuators to bring down the actual volume that you send into the cab while still being able to crank the amp. So I don't do that a lot. How about you?
No, because normally I'm not in a place that I need to be quiet, so it's not really a problem. And there's normally like haven't really run into that I need to turn it down to get it dirtier. That's not really a thing. But that said, there was one on the chain. I can't remember if it was on, like we were using a Stevenson amp and it was either built into that or we had it going into like an IR capture or something. And there was an attenuator built into that. So I played with it just for the fun of it. Yeah. And it's cool. Like, yeah. So, well, it's not relevant or that relevant using an attenuator for Benny and I. Well, I should just quickly say, if you're not sure what an attenuator is, it allows you to turn down the amp before it hits the speaker. So it's between the amp and the speaker. So you can drive the amp super loud, max it all out if you wanted to, and then turn it down before it hits the speaker. So your amp is working really hard despite the speaker not being very loud. That's kind of the idea. For us, again, doesn't seem like it's something super relevant, but for our audience, it might be exactly what you need. Because if you are, I know people that have attenuators and live in apartments and record rock guitars using real amps in their apartment. And attenuators make that very much more possible, right? Because you can have your amp pushed without it being loud, essentially. Yeah. You are going to be missing out on that speaker moving kind of action, like we talked about, using the output to change how the speaker responds. But in general, it's not really that big of a deal if it's quiet. I think you'll be fine.
There's two cases that I can think of that might make it worth using an attenuator. The first is that what you just described, the scenario where you just have to be quiet but still want to use your real amp. And the second one is, I think, where you have a one-channel amp with no master volume and you want to have it clean but loud. The other way around. You want to have it dirty but quiet, and you can only get the tone that you want
by cranking
the amp, and then you have to bring it down. That's the case with some amps. Like if you have a Plexi without a master volume, for example, and you just have to turn it up in order for it to distort, then it's going to be crazy loud, and you need an attenuator to be able to play at a reasonable volume. So in those cases, it's almost a must to have it.
Yeah.
But in most cases, it's actually not. And again, there's no magic to power amp sound usually. And you have to know that there's a trade-off, there's a sacrifice, because these attenuators, they also have a sound, most of them at least, some more, some less, but they will color your tone. And what you think you are getting from the power amp might not be worth it, because the sound of the attenuator is actually worse than what you're getting from the power amp. So it's always this trade-off, and it's hard to compare these things, and you have to be really careful and compare it at equal volume after you've recorded it, to figure out whether the attenuator is really worth it. But in those situations where you just have to be quieter, or you want to use the distortion, but it's just too loud, then it's almost a must. And then those are great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth keeping in mind that your amp works really hard when doing this. Because like whatever you've cranked it to, your amp is working that hard despite how loud it is now. So you can burn out an amp if you're not careful. You can burn out the attenuator too. They don't last forever generally. Their job is hard. So careful with that, I would say. Exactly. But thinking back, I wanted one when I was playing live and used real amps before the Kemper days, because I think it was a Vox. I can't remember what I was playing, but I had some amp at some point that was like, you turned it on just like the volume little tiny bit, almost at one, and it's like, oh my god, too loud, like for a live show. And like, it's like a 300 person room. It's not tiny, and it's still too loud for the room. So it's like an attenuator would actually give you some control over the volume on some of these, like especially Fender amps, those high watt Fender amps that are so loud. There's no in between.
That's true. We have this problem in one of my bands where our guitarist always complains that he has an 800. And he's like, I'm on, and he even has a master volume, but still, he's like, I'm like below 1. If I turn it down any lower, it starts to sort of disappear. Like it's almost like an on and off switch at this point. Like I can't get any lower, but it's still crazy loud. So
that's where an attenuator might help.
Yeah, exactly. Now that the working hard part brings us to the next thing here. It's just real quick. I just want to mention it because I know that a lot of people don't pay enough attention. Tubes need to be replaced every now and again, or need to be your amp needs maintenance, and you might buy a used amp and it might have the same tubes in it for the last 20 years, and you don't know, and you just keep playing, and it works, but until you change the tubes, until you replace the tubes, you don't know what that amp could actually sound like, because they definitely change. The sound degrades, it gets worse over time, or at least different, and it's a drastic difference after a couple of years. So they need maintenance. And also, you can change the tubes and replace them with different ones. So that's also a thing it's not too hard to do, actually. And you could turn an amp into a slightly different sounding amp, or you could change the characteristic by just swapping out tubes. You need to do research before that, and I don't recommend anybody who doesn't know what they're doing to open up an amp and start experimenting with that. But it can be done. There are even amp sims these days that give you different tube options. We can swap between them. And if it's a great way to learn about that as well. Like if, for example, the Neural DSP Omega Ampworks Granifier plugin that I love and have, you can switch between 3 different tubes in there, and you can have a listen what they to like and see what that sounds like. And it's actually a pretty noticeable difference. So changing tubes in your amp can be an option, but just make sure you replace them or have them checked every now and again. And if you're using the same amps for the past decade and you already bought it used, it's maybe time to check it and maybe replace them.
Yeah, it could keep it good. Another thing, recording projects go on quite a long time sometimes, so you don't want to have an amp die partway through tracking, like a tube go down, then you have to come back and it sounds different. It's like bummer. So careful with that. So just getting it to service before a big recording project, probably worth it.
Yeah, not too expensive.
They have to be biased correctly. So again, I would recommend handing it off to somebody that knows what they're doing. It's not rocket science, but it's, you also don't need to even bother thinking about it. Now, I would say, though, we're getting kind of to the tweaky stuff. So remember, we're talking about tubes, but changing the tubes isn't going to make the wrong amp the right amp.
Yeah.
It's going to change the right amp into a slightly different version of a right amp, So you have to get that initial bucket correct first. Exactly.
And that's about it, actually, for this episode. I don't want to get into much more detail than that.
Yeah.
It's just some tricks that I had in mind to make the most of what you already have. If you are in the right category, but you still feel like you're missing something, these are things you can do. Trying different pedals, boosting the amp, taking advantage of the box tone of your pedal, trying different cable lengths, using attenuators, replacing or changing tubes. These are just things you can do to further tweak your already appropriate amp, but all of that is useless if you're starting out with the wrong amp.
Yeah, and of course, capture DI, because your mixer might have the right amp.
Exactly. Okay, so I hope that helps. As always, rules are meant to be broken, so if you know all these things, but you still want to use something completely different or whatever, then feel free to do it, of course.
Absolutely.
If you want to make a metal record with an AC30, more power to you. It's of course possible, and people do all sorts of weird things, but it just helps as a starting point, I think. And I think you should know the rules before you start breaking them, because you just have more overall knowledge and control and more options, and it's going to be a much more intentional process and less trial and error.
Totally. Yeah, it's all about getting those memory markers in your head of okay, you know what? I've achieved that typical rock sound with a Marshall. Now I know what that is, and we can recreate that if we want to. But right now I want to try something different, so we're going to use this broken amp from my mom's old record player and see what that sounds like. Have that. We know what the real version would sound like if we went down the most typical road. But let's try this and see what we think.
Exactly. And there's no excuse to use your crappy practice amp just because that's the one you happen to have. There's amp sims. Same principles apply. You can get a decent sounding amp sim for, I don't know, $100 or $200 or something.
Crazy.
Or you can just rent the real deal from a backline company and you get a well-serviced, great amp that you can have for a week or so. So there's no excuse. Just do it. Put it on your budget, and just use the amp that is appropriate and works for the genre.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you for listening.
Before we go, come join us at selfrecordingband.com/community, or search for the Self-Recording Band community on Facebook, and come hang out with us there and chat about stuff like guitar tones and using record players as amps.
Exactly. Thank you for that, Malcolm. It's funny how we talk about mentioning that and telling people about the community, and we actually should do that in the beginning of the episode, but then I completely forget 5 minutes later.
Yeah, we start talking about me getting into fights while running and stuff.
Exactly. So thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, go to the selfrecordingband.com/community, as Malcolm said. And we'd love to hear your opinions, because we know guitar players definitely have opinions, and we want to hear all of them.
Yeah. If you've done an unusual recording scenario that worked out really well, I'd love to hear it. Post in the community, share what you used. There's sometimes funky things do really cool stuff.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you for listening.
Take care.